Beneath the desert of southern Iraq, archaeologists can trace a city tied to Alexander the Great. Beneath the North Sea, ancient DNA is revealing a drowned forest. And in Greece, wooden tools nearly 500,000 years old have survived. These discoveries share one lesson: the past we reconstruct is shaped by what survives. So what did archaeology actually change in 2026? In southern Iraq, close to the modern border with Iran, the landscape is almost aggressively flat. Dust, low vegetation, irrigation channels, and stretches of ground that seem to offer little reason to stop. Then a long ridge appears. It does not look like the remains of one of the ancient Near East's major cities. The ridge is part of a city wall. Inside it lie the traces of streets, buildings, industrial areas, canals, and harbor facilities belonging to a settlement associated with one of the most famous names in ancient history, Alexander the Great. The site is known today as Jelkhayber. The ancient city is generally identified with Alexandria on the Tigris, later known as Carnyx Spasinu. Calling this a city that was suddenly discovered in 2026 would be misleading. Scholars had suspected the site's identity for decades. Aerial photographs examined in the 20th century had already revealed the outlines of an enormous fortified settlement, and researchers had connected those remains with ancient descriptions of the city. What changed was the quality of the evidence. Modern survey work has allowed archaeologists to map the buried city in extraordinary detail without excavating it. Drone photography records subtle changes in the terrain from above. Magnetometry measures variations in the magnetic properties of the ground, allowing buried walls, streets, kilns, and other features to appear as patterns in the data. The result is something close to an X-ray of an ancient metropolis, and it is much larger and more organized than the empty desert above it suggests. Researchers can trace planned streets and large urban blocks. They can identify areas associated with craft production. They can see parts of the water infrastructure that once connected the settlement to the rivers and the Gulf beyond. That location was the reason the city existed. When Alexander returned west after his campaigns to India in the late 4th century BC, southern Mesopotamia sat at one of the most valuable commercial crossroads on Earth. Goods moving down the Tigris and Euphrates river systems could reach the Persian Gulf. From there, ships connected Mesopotamia with ports further east. Trade networks extended toward Arabia, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent. A major harbor in this region was not simply a local market. It was a gateway between worlds. And then geography began working against it.
Southern Mesopotamia is not a fixed landscape.
Rivers migrate.
Channels silt up. Coastlines move as sediment accumulates. A harbor that is perfectly placed in one century can become increasingly useless in another.
Over time, the relationship between the city and the main river channels changed. As access deteriorated, the commercial advantage that had sustained the settlement weakened with it. There does not need to have been one dramatic night when the city died. No invading army had to erase it. A port can disappear through something much slower. The water simply stops going where the city needs it to go. That may be the most revealing part of the story. The ruins were never truly gone. The city wall was still there. Streets remained beneath the soil. Ancient writers had left descriptions of the place. What had been lost was the connection between all of those pieces. Modern geophysical survey is restoring that connection. That makes the next stage crucial. Survey can show where structures are. Excavation can begin to reveal when they were built, how they changed, what people consumed, what they produced, who they traded with, and how different parts of the city were actually used. For now, political and security conditions in the region continue to complicate fieldwork. So much of the city remains unopened, and that creates an unusual situation. Archaeologists already know that a vast urban landscape is there. They can map parts of it. They can connect it to ancient geography and historical texts. Much of the human story inside those streets is still sealed beneath the ground. In Iraq, the obstacle is access. Our next discovery involves a much more permanent problem. The landscape itself is gone. Thousands of years ago, Britain was not an island. Across what is now the southern North Sea stretched a broad expanse of plains, rivers, wetlands, and low hills connecting Britain to continental Europe. Archaeologists call this vanished region Doggerland. For generations, the basic story seemed clear. As the last ice age ended, global temperatures rose, ice sheets melted, sea level climbed. The North Sea expanded across the lowlands until the connection between Britain and Europe disappeared beneath the water. Evidence that people had once occupied this drowned world occasionally came back to the surface. Fishing vessels pulled prehistoric animal bones from the seabed. Stone and bone artifacts appeared in nets. One famous find was a barbed bone point recovered from the North Sea in the 20th century. These objects proved that the seabed had once been dry land used by humans. They could tell researchers surprisingly little about what that landscape actually looked like. That is where a 2026 study changed the picture. Instead of searching for houses or stone tools, researchers examined mud, marine cores taken from the seabed preserve layers of sediment laid down thousands of years ago. Inside those sediments are microscopic fragments of genetic mistakes made by the plants that once grew there. This is sedimentary ancient DNA. No intact leaf has to survive. No tree trunk has to remain. A fragment of DNA preserved in the mud can still identify the organisms that once occupied a landscape that no longer exists. Researchers analyzed hundreds of samples from dozens of sediment cores along the route of an ancient river system in southern Doggerland. The genetic record reached back roughly 16,000 years. And what appeared was not the bleak, almost treeless corridor that a simple land bridge image might suggest. There were woodlands, oak, elm, hazel. Trees were established in parts of this drowned landscape surprisingly early, while the world was still emerging from the final stages of the Ice Age. That matters because scientists have spent more than a century trying to understand how forests returned to northern Europe so quickly after the glaciers retreated. Trees do not move north within a single generation. Forests advance through repeated cycles of growth, seed dispersal, and establishment. If every tree species had been forced far into southern Europe during the coldest phases of the Ice Age, their rapid return northward becomes difficult to explain. Doggerland may provide part of the answer. Some trees may already have been much closer than researchers assumed, and hidden beneath the North Sea was evidence of a landscape capable of preserving them. The possibility is important because it changes the direction of the problem. Instead of asking how forests raced northward across an empty post-glacial landscape, researchers can ask whether some of those forests had survived closer to the north all along, sheltered in local refuges where conditions remained favorable enough for them to persist. One of the strangest signals in the Doggerland sediments came from Archaeological, a genus related to walnut. Its presence was unexpected because the tree was thought to have disappeared from northwestern Europe hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The DNA does not by itself prove exactly how large or continuous these surviving populations were. Sedimentary DNA can travel, and ancient environments are rarely reconstructed from a single signal. The finding is consistent with the idea that southern Doggerland contained pockets of vegetation that survived conditions once assumed to have eliminated them from the region. That makes Doggerland more than a convenient bridge between Britain and continental Europe. It becomes a habitat in its own right, a place with rivers, woodlands, and ecological resources that could have supported people for long periods before rising seas erased the landscape. The distinction matters. There is direct evidence that humans used the broader Doggerland region. Artifacts recovered from the seabed have demonstrated that for decades. What the new environmental DNA adds is context. It begins to reconstruct the world those people may have moved through. not an empty strip of exposed ground, a changing landscape with trees, waterways, animals, and resources. And that raises a difficult archaeological problem. If some of the most habitable parts of northwestern Europe during this period are now underwater, then a substantial fraction of the evidence for the people who used them is underwater too. Doggerland was gradually submerged as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. The transformation took thousands of years. Lowlands became wetlands. Wetlands became tidal zones. Channels widened. Higher ground became islands. Then those islands disappeared as well. The Storegga tsunami, generated by a huge submarine landslide off Norway roughly 8,000 years ago, struck parts of the North Sea coast during this long process. It was once easy to imagine that disaster as the single dramatic end of Doggerland. The real story appears more complicated. Different parts of the landscape disappeared at different times. Some areas may have survived above water after the tsunami. There was no single moment when an entire country vanished beneath one wave. Again, the evidence points toward gradual change rather than cinematic catastrophe. That pattern will return throughout this episode. Archaeology often becomes more interesting when the simple story fails. The power of the Doggerland study is not that it discovered a lost civilization beneath the North Sea. It did not. It recovered something more basic and, in some ways, more useful: an ecosystem. That ecosystem changes what kinds of human life were possible there. And it demonstrates how a landscape can disappear almost completely while still leaving enough genetic traces behind to be reconstructed thousands of years later. Water is not the only thing that removes evidence from the archaeological record. Sometimes the evidence disappears for a much simpler reason: it rots. At Marathusa 1 in southern Greece, researchers have been excavating a Middle Pleistocene site associated with animal remains, stone tools, and repeated hominin activity. Among the finds are the remains of a straight-tusked elephant, an enormous species that lived across parts of Europe during the Pleistocene. Cut marks and stone artifacts show that hominins were processing animal carcasses at the site. That already makes Marathusa important. The most unusual evidence from the site is not stone. It is wood. Wood almost never survives for hundreds of thousands of years. Once exposed to oxygen, microorganisms, and changing moisture, it breaks down quickly. A wooden spear can disappear completely while a crude stone flake from the same campsite remains almost unchanged. That creates a powerful distortion. When archaeologists look deep into the human past, stone dominates the record not necessarily because stone dominated life, but because stone survived. Marathusa gives us a glimpse of what that filter normally removes. Researchers identified wooden artifacts dating to roughly 430,000 years ago. They show deliberate modification. In other words, these were not simply branches lying beside a site. They had been worked. That pushes the known record of handheld wooden tools substantially deeper into the past. Before finds like these, some of the most famous evidence for complex woodworking came from much younger sites, including the wooden spears from Schöningen in Germany. Those weapons, roughly 300,000 years old, transformed ideas about early human hunting because they showed careful shaping, planning, and technical control. Marathusa pushes evidence of deliberate wood technology back even further. And this is where caution becomes essential. We do not know exactly who made the Marathusa wooden tools. No diagnostic hominin remains from the relevant context allow archaeologists to assign them confidently to a particular species. It is tempting to put a familiar name on the makers. Homo heidelbergensis is often invoked for European populations of this broad period. The fossils and classifications of Middle Pleistocene humans are complicated, and the site does not give us a maker's identity. The safest conclusion is also the most important one. A hominin population in Greece was deliberately working wood around 430,000 years ago. That alone is enough to change the picture. The precise functions of the wooden pieces are also still being studied. Their association with the site where an elephant carcass was processed makes it easy to imagine spears, digging tools, or implements used in butchery. Association is not proof. The artifacts do not automatically tell us whether they were used to kill an animal, cut it apart, dig into the ground, strip vegetation, or perform some other task that left little direct trace. What they do reveal is a planning process. Wood has to be selected. Its shape has to be understood. It has to be modified for some intended use. The object has to exist in the maker's mind before the finished tool exists in the hand. And this creates a broader problem for archaeology. If wooden tools were being made 430,000 years ago, how many earlier examples have vanished completely? How much cordage disappeared? How many containers? How many handles? How many traps, digging sticks, shelters, woven objects, or other technologies were used routinely and left almost nothing behind? The archaeological record is not a complete inventory of ancient behavior. It is a survival contest. Stone usually wins. Wood usually loses. At exceptional sites like Meretusa, the rules temporarily reverse, and when that happens, the image of early human capability expands. This is the deeper connection between Doggerland and Meretusa. In one case, the missing evidence is under the sea. In the other, it normally decays. The discoveries are important not because they produce a spectacular object for a museum display, but because they expose the blind spots built into the evidence itself. And the next discovery pushes that problem even further, because some of the most important things about ancient populations were never physical objects at all. Around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population from Europe. They had lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They survived repeated climatic swings. They made sophisticated tools. They used fire. They processed animal hides and plant materials. There is evidence for pigments, adhesives, symbolic behavior, and care for injured members of their groups. They also encountered Homo sapiens. We know that because the encounter survives inside living people. Most people with substantial ancestry outside Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. So when Neanderthals disappear from the archaeological and fossil record, the story cannot simply be that two populations met and one immediately destroyed the other. There was interaction, there was interbreeding, there were long periods of overlap, and the disappearance did not unfold in exactly the same way everywhere. For decades, researchers have proposed explanations: climate instability, competition, demographic weakness, disease violence, assimilation through interbreeding. None works comfortably as a single universal answer. A 2026 study approached the problem from another direction. Instead of asking which event killed the Neanderthals, the researcher asked how well Neanderthal populations were connected to one another across the landscapes they occupied. The method came partly from ecology. Conservation biologists often study habitat connectivity to understand why some animal populations survive environmental pressure while others collapse. A species may have plenty of suitable habitat in total. If that habitat is broken into isolated patches, the populations living inside those patches become vulnerable. When one group declines, neighboring groups may be too distant to replenish it. Genetic diversity falls. Local disasters become harder to recover from. A population can disappear without one enormous catastrophe. It can simply lose resilience. The researchers applied that kind of reasoning to reconstructed habitats for Neanderthals and Homo sapiens during the period when both populations occupied Europe. And the pattern they found was not the same for the two groups. Suitable habitats for Homo sapiens formed a more connected network across large parts of Europe. Neanderthal habitat was more fragmented in important regions. That does not mean archaeologists have discovered the single reason Neanderthals vanished. They have not. It changes the question, because if one population was operating through a more connected network while another was increasingly divided into smaller and more isolated groups, then the same climate shock, food shortage, or local population decline would not affect them equally. One network could absorb losses. The other might not. A small group can lose members to disease, injury, a run of poor hunting, or an unusually severe winter. If neighboring communities are close enough, people can move between them. Partners can be found, knowledge can circulate. Genetic diversity can be restored. If those connections weaken, every local problem becomes harder to absorb. The 2026 modeling suggests that this kind of fragmentation may have affected Neanderthal populations differently across Europe. In some Western regions, Neanderthal and Homo sapiens habitats overlapped more directly. There, competition may have mattered more. The two populations could have been using similar landscapes, pursuing some of the same animals, and occupying some of the same ecological space. One population may reproduce faster. It may maintain larger social networks. It may exchange information across greater distances. It may recover more effectively when a local group is hit by loss. Over many generations, small demographic advantages can become decisive. In other regions, especially farther east, the process may have looked different. There, increasing isolation could make some Neanderthal groups more vulnerable, even without intense direct competition. Interbreeding adds another layer. If small Neanderthal populations repeatedly mixed with larger Homo sapiens populations, then disappearance did not necessarily mean every Neanderthal lineage ended. Some were absorbed. Their distinct population identity faded while parts of their ancestry survived in the genomes of later humans. That is why the phrase Neanderthal extinction can hide several different processes: local population collapse, competition, isolation, climate pressure, interbreeding, demographic absorption. Different regions may have experienced different combinations. The connectivity study does not settle all of that. It gives researchers a framework for understanding why the same external pressures could produce different outcomes depending on how populations were arranged across the landscape. And this is the point where the pattern behind these 2026 discoveries becomes clearer. The most important archaeological evidence is not always a spectacular new object. Sometimes, it is a method that allows researchers to recover something the traditional record barely preserves. Doggerland revealed an ecosystem through DNA and sediment. Marathosa preserved a technology usually destroyed by decay. The Neanderthal study reconstructed relationships between populations that left no direct object behind. The next case involves something even harder to see: disease. For most of human history, pathogens left almost no recognizable archaeological trace. A skeleton might show trauma. It might preserve signs of long-term infection, nutritional stress, or chronic illness. Many diseases kill without leaving a distinctive mark on bone. A person can die during an epidemic and leave behind a skeleton that looks, thousands of years later, almost entirely ordinary. Ancient DNA has changed that. In 2026, researchers studying hunter-gatherer burials around Lake Baikal in Siberia identified genetic evidence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. The remains were around 5,500 years old. That alone would have been important. What made finding more significant was the social context. These were not residents of a crowded city. They were not farmers living beside grain stores in dense permanent settlements. They belonged to prehistoric hunter-gatherer communities. That forces a change in how the early history of plague is imagined. The disease is most famous for much later events. The plague of justice in the 6th century. the Black Death in medieval Eurasia. The third plague pandemic beginning in the 19th century. Those outbreaks occurred in worlds of cities, trade ships, markets, and dense populations. That historical experience makes it easy to assume that plague became important only after human societies reached that level of crowding. The Lake Baikal evidence shows that the relationship between Yersinia pestis and humans began much earlier. Researchers detected the bacterium in multiple individuals from the prehistoric burial context. The pattern was strong enough to support the interpretation that outbreaks were affecting small communities, including closely related people. That does not mean prehistoric Siberia experienced the same disease ecology as medieval Europe. Early Yersinia pestis lineages were not identical to the later strains associated with classic bubonic plague. Because it means plague was capable of circulating in human populations before the social environments most people associate with epidemic disease had developed. That raises a difficult question. How? Hunter-gatherer groups are generally smaller and more dispersed than urban populations. A pathogen that burns rapidly through one small group risks reaching a dead end if no new hosts are nearby. For sustained transmission, either people must remain connected across wider networks, or the bacterium must persist in animal reservoirs and re-enter human communities repeatedly. Both possibilities fit a world in which hunter-gatherers were more socially connected than their small settlement sizes might suggest. Mobility did not necessarily mean isolation. People traveled. They exchanged materials. They formed partnerships between groups. They returned to seasonal gathering places. Networks could extend across enormous distances even when individual communities remained small. A pathogen does not need a city if it has another route through the landscape. Ancient DNA is now giving researchers a way to test those possibilities directly. The past did not suddenly become more complicated in 2026. The evidence became capable of revealing complications that had always been there. A drowned forest was still a forest before anyone sequenced its sediment. Wooden technology existed whether or not it survived. Neanderthal populations had oceanography whether or not archaeologists could model it. Pathogens moved through prehistoric communities whether or not bones recorded their names. Sometimes a discovery changes history because something new is found. Sometimes it changes history because researchers finally learn how to detect what was previously invisible. And then there are discoveries that do almost the opposite. They preserve something so physical, so recognizable that a vanished part of ancient life suddenly becomes easy to imagine. In the summer of 2025, a metal-detecting discovery in West Norfolk, England, revealed an Iron Age hoard unlike any ordinary deposit of coins or jewelry. The find was publicly announced in early 2026. At its center was a nearly complete carnyx. A carnyx was a long bronze war horn used in Iron Age Europe. It was designed to be held vertically, with the bell rising above the player's head. The surviving examples often terminate in an animal-shaped mouth. To someone seeing one for the first time, it can look less like a musical instrument than a creature cast in metal. Roman art shows carnyxes raised over Celtic and other northern European warriors. Ancient writers described the noise of battlefields filled with horns and shouting. The instrument was not designed for subtle performance. It projected sound over crowds, it announced presence, it created identity, and very few survive. Metal can last longer than wood, but large, hollow bronze objects are vulnerable to corrosion, recycling, and deliberate destruction. A complete or nearly complete carnyx is therefore exceptionally rare. The Norfolk example was found with the remains of another carnyx, a bronze boar head standard and shield fittings. That combination immediately complicates the interpretation. These were not random pieces of script metal. They were objects connected to warfare, display, and group identity. The boar had particular symbolic weight across Iron Age Europe. It appears on weapons, standards, ornaments, and ritual objects. Its exact meaning varied by context, but associations with strength, aggression, status, and the sacred recur often enough that its presence here is unlikely to be accidental. The deposit raises the obvious question, why bury objects like these? One possibility is practical concealment. Valuable metal could be hidden during conflict and never recovered. That explanation works for some hoards. Archaeologists have long recognized that many prehistoric deposits do not behave like emergency savings. Objects are sometimes selected in particular combinations. They may be placed in wetlands, pits, or boundary locations. Some are broken before deposition. Others include items whose social or ceremonial importance may have been greater than their simple material value. In those cases, ritual deposition becomes a serious interpretation. The Norfolk hoard may belong to that broader pattern. The motive cannot be read directly from the soil. No inscription tells us why these particular objects were placed together. The safest conclusion is that the deposition was deliberate. Its meaning remains open, and that uncertainty is useful. Because the carnyx does something unusual for archaeology. It brings us close to a sensory world that objects normally fail to preserve. A sword can show us how something was made. A shield boss can show us how protection was constructed. A horn suggests sound. It suggests the physical experience of hundreds of people hearing a metallic, animal-shaped instrument above a crowd. It suggests ceremony, warning, movement, or battle. The bronze survives. The sound does not. For once, the object gives us enough to know that the silence of the archaeological record is misleading. The Norfolk carnyx sits on that boundary between object and experience. The archaeological significance of the Norfolk hoard is not simply that an ancient horn survived, it is the context around it. Together, they suggest a collection tied to public display, warfare, ceremony, or some combination of all three. In Iron Age societies without written histories of their own surviving on anything like the scale of Greece or Rome, objects such as these carry an unusual burden. A carnyx raised above a gathering says something those societies chose to say about themselves. So does a bore standard. So does the decision to place both in the ground. We may never recover the precise meaning of that act. Perhaps these objects had reached the end of their useful lives. Perhaps they were trophies. Perhaps they were deposited as part of a ritual. Perhaps their burial marked a political or military event whose story disappeared because nobody wrote it down. At present, the soil does not allow us to choose confidently between all of those possibilities. And that is not a failure. Knowing where the evidence ends is part of knowing what the evidence means. Across these 6 discoveries, that boundary has appeared again and again. In Iraq, researchers can map the structure of a major ancient city while much of the life inside it remains unexcavated. Under the North Sea, DNA can reconstruct vegetation from a landscape whose surface has vanished. At Maratusa, rare preservation reveals wood technology that normally disappears almost completely. The Neanderthal study can model the connectivity of populations that left no map of their own social networks. At Lake Baikal, ancient DNA can identify a pathogen invisible to the naked eye, and in Norfolk, a bronze instrument survives while the sound and ceremony surrounding it are gone. These are not 6 versions of the same archaeological mystery. They are 6 different kinds of missing evidence. That distinction changes how we should think about archaeological discovery. Some pieces were destroyed before archaeology existed. Some decayed. Some were carried away by rivers. Some disappeared beneath the sea. Some were never objects at all. Some survive only as chemical traces, genetic fragments or patterns distributed across a landscape, and some may be permanently unrecoverable. The archaeological record is therefore not simply incomplete. It is incomplete in systematic ways. Stone survives better than wood. Burials preserve different evidence from settlements. Dry caves preserve materials that open tropical sites destroy. Coastlines hide evidence when sea levels rise. Written societies leave different kinds of testimony from societies whose histories were primarily oral. If those biases are ignored, absence can become misleading. A technology may look as though it did not exist because it was made from perishable material. A region may look sparsely populated because its most attractive ancient landscape is now underwater. A disease may appear historically recent because pathogens leave few visible traces in skeletons. A population may seem to vanish suddenly because the social process behind its disappearance cannot be excavated as an object. This is where the discoveries of 2026 become more significant as a group than they are individually. None requires the claim that archaeology has been overturned. None proves that everything we thought about the ancient world was wrong. The stronger lesson is more precise. Our picture improves when the kinds of evidence we can recover expand. Environmental DNA is one example. Ancient pathogen genomics is another. Geophysical survey is another. Computational modeling adds a different kind of evidence again. And occasionally, extraordinary preservation gives archaeologists something far simpler. An object made from a material that almost never lasts. Each method opens a different window. And each window comes with its own limits. Sedimentary DNA can identify organisms, but it cannot automatically reconstruct every detail of an ecosystem. A habitat model can reveal patterns of connectivity, but it cannot tell us exactly what one Neanderthal group said or did when another population arrived. Pathogen DNA can prove infection, but it cannot by itself reconstruct every route of transmission. A carnyx can demonstrate that an instrument existed, but it cannot tell us what one particular audience felt when it heard it. Good archaeology lives inside those boundaries. It takes the strongest conclusion the evidence allows and stops before certainty becomes invention. That restraint does not make the past less interesting. It usually makes it more interesting. Archaeology does not become stronger by pretending every unanswered question has an answer. It becomes stronger when new evidence allows an old question to be asked more precisely. That may be the clearest lesson from these discoveries. The ancient world was not waiting for 2026 to become complicated. It was always complicated. What changed was our ability to see more of it. A buried city becomes legible through magnetometry. A drowned forest returns through fragments of DNA. A vanished technology survives in waterlogged wood. An extinction becomes a problem of networks as well as climate and competition. A prehistoric disease becomes visible inside ancient genome. A silent bronze horn restores the outline of a sound no written source can fully reproduce. The record remains incomplete. It always will. Incomplete does not mean unknowable. Every new method changes the boundary between what has disappeared and what can still be recovered. And when that boundary moves, the past does not become less mysterious because another secret has been solved. It becomes more complete, and almost always more interesting than the simplified version we had before.